About a week ago, we put out a video going over commercial trucks, semi-trucks, tractors, whatever you want to call them, why they all use inline-six engines, and why previously, some older ones, they had used V8s and some other configurations, but why pretty much all modern trucks used inline-six engines. And most of that revolves around torque, ease of maintenance, and lack of size limitations. But that got me thinking, there's no size limitations because trucks here in the US can be huge because our roads are very wide. But what about other places like Europe, for example, where the roads are much smaller and there are size limitations? You couldn't just stick a massive Peterbilt on some Italian road and hope for the best. On top of that, that last video that I had just mentioned got a ton of comments mentioning Scania, who is a company that I personally had not heard of because they're not really here in the US. They have no presence here. But overseas, they are massive. So with that in mind, let's take a deep dive into Scania trucks and why they use a V8 configuration as opposed to pretty much every other commercial truck maker who uses an inline-six. Before we look at why Scania uses the V8, why they developed it, and why they still use it, we should briefly take a look at the differences between American commercial trucks and European, or basically anywhere else, commercial trucks, because there's a big difference between those two. If you look at US trucks, they're almost all conventional style, meaning the engine is in front of the cab. Ultimately, that means that the trucks here in the US are pretty big in length. For example, sleeper cab trucks, which not only have the engine in front of the cab, but also have a massive sleeper as part of the cab, which makes the total wheelbase massive. The massive size of these trucks isn't an issue in the US, like I mentioned before, because our roads are very wide. So maneuverability isn't necessarily at a premium over things like comfort, cab space, ease of maintenance, and most importantly, fuel economy, because many of these trucks are traveling hundreds of miles per day, unless you're talking about something like a day cab truck, although those can see some pretty serious mileage too. On the other hand, in places like Europe, where the roads are generally much smaller, even outside the city, roads over there are pretty small as compared to roads here. On top of that, intra-city roads are even smaller, and so maneuverability is at a premium over absolutely everything else, which is why trucks in Europe are pretty much all cab over or cab forward, however you want to call it. Now, a cab over or cab forward truck is a truck where instead of having the engine in front of the cab is essentially on top of the engine. Now, this helps save space because the truck can be much shorter. The point is that the trucks in Europe are much shorter because they need extra maneuverability, especially in city. With that out of the way, let's take a look at where the Scania V8 came from, and to do that we need to rewind the clock to the late 1960s, which is when they introduced the 350 horsepower 14-liter V8 turbo diesel engine, known as the DS14. Up until that point, Scania had done things such as building cars, bicycles, industrial engines, buses, fire trucks, and a lot more. Really, up until their V8 engine release, you could argue that they didn't have a brand image or something to remember them for. Sure, they were interesting and they were a cool little Swedish company, but there was nothing really special about them. I think it's also worth noting that they technically had a V8 engine prior to 1969, through a partnership with Mack, but that's relatively unimportant to this story, so we're not going to get into it. Now, there are a few reasons for releasing a V8 engine as opposed to what they already had. A big one is packaging, which we went over in the last video with the inline-six engines, but to briefly recap, a cab-over truck doesn't have as much engine compartment space as a conventional truck, and V engines are more space efficient than inline engines, which means switching to a V8 engine helps save cab space, which is at a premium in cab-over trucks because you're basically sitting on top of the engine. An interesting thing to note about that original 14-liter engine is that it blew the doors off of everything else in Europe at that time, producing 350 horsepower when most other options only produce 250 to 260 horsepower. With more power, you can haul heavier loads at higher speeds, meaning you can get more work done and get paid more. Not only that, it was determined that a more powerful truck that could cruise at higher speeds actually improved highway safety, as overtaking it when you were in a normal car was easier because the speed differential between the truck and the car wasn't so exaggerated. In 1976, the DS14 was upgraded to 375 horsepower, and then the power continued to be upgraded throughout the years. Now, if we were to take a massive jump forwards to today, Scania is still using the V8 engine configuration, although now they are past the DS14 engine platform and the power levels are pretty insane, with their current top-of-the-line engine that they released in 2020 producing 770 horsepower and 2,200 pound-feet of torque. But the question is, why did they stick with a V8 this whole time? Well, there are a few reasons, but a big one is simply heritage. It's ultimately something that helped give their brand a unique identity. Packaging is another one, as though there are significantly more size constraints in a cab-over truck, especially one that needs to be super maneuverable and to scoot around tight European roads. That being said, the V8 configuration that Scania uses isn't nearly as balanced as an inline-six. It has to share bearing space on the crank, and it doesn't have quite as much stroke as an inline-six engine. That being said, the DC16, which is the 770 horsepower engine that I was talking about a moment ago, that engine has a bore of 130 millimeters by 154 millimeters. So they were still able to get a fairly long stroke out of this engine, although it's not as extreme as something like a Cummins X15. Really though, for Scania, it almost all comes down to heritage. The V8 diesel is what helped grow their brand to new heights, and it's what their customers expected them to continue with. They've had plenty of chances to switch to an inline-six engine, but they've stuck with their roots, and as such, they've built quite a following in Europe, as well as other parts of the world. You could argue that they are the most popular truck brand in Europe, but the point is, they stuck with their V8 configuration, and even though an inline-six might have more pros on paper, the cons of the V8 configuration can be and have been covered with good engineering from Scania. Their current engine platform, which is the DC16, is about as advanced as any engine out there in terms of the commercial truck world. It uses dual overhead cams, 4 valves per cylinder, and a fully gear-driven system. And really, a lot of the parts are parts that you could find on an inline-six engine, which meant that the DC16 was a lot more modular than previous engine platforms, which simply makes it better in pretty much every single way. Now, if you're like me and you're wondering why isn't Scania here in the US, they actually were here in the US at one point, but they simply really can't compete with other truck manufacturers, especially the fact that Scania pretty much completely moved over to a cab-over design. And here in the US, cab-over trucks are pretty much non-existent. We had them here at one point, but with safety and aerodynamics in mind, a conventional truck is a lot more popular. And on top of that, the way that the US has set up their roads and the requirements for it actually punishes shorter wheelbase trucks. So something like a cab-over actually has a less favorable length to weight ratio. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a big thumbs up. If you think there's anything I left out, or if you're somebody out there who drives a Scania truck, or you're just a big fan of Scania, drop a comment down below. Let me know all about your experiences with them and their engines. Be sure to check out some of the other videos on the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.